Hi, I'm Von Solis. Welcome to the Trauma and Grief series. This episode we're going to be talking about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and how it affects all of your relationships. But first, before that, I'd like to welcome you to this very, very beautiful part of central Vancouver Island, which is Lantzville Beach. It's absolutely gorgeous with the coast mountains behind us, a gorgeous sunny day, perfect for early August. So talking about post-traumatic stress disorder and relationships, and again, when I talk about all the trauma work I'm doing on this channel, it's always going to be related to grief. And trauma and grief is something that is not really acknowledged within the medical community as such, the scientific community for research, and certainly not by grievers themselves. So the point to this series, Trauma and Grief, and specifically when I'm going to be talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, it's always in mind, it's always in mind to share information based on my personal experience and the research I have done over several years to try and understand the symptoms and try and acquire the tools to preserve my relationships, preserve my family, and of course return to a more optimal state of health. So the first thing I really want to stress is that PTSD actually changes the brain. It is a mental disorder, but it is a physical disorder as well, and it's really, really important for people to understand, and specifically in our relationships, for those we're living with and those that we're depending on for support, that they understand that as well. So how does it affect the brain? The first thing it does is it actually changes the part of our brain that's responsible for perception. So where other people see things as normal, the person with PTSD is always going to be looking for danger. It's called enhanced perception. The second thing that it does is it changes our filtering system. And this is a part of the middle brain that's responsible for helping people to be in the present and basically understand what's relevant and what's not, what they can, quote, dismiss, unquote. So again, for the person with PTSD, they have a lot of difficulty with being in the moment, and they may obsess about something and not really understand when something is not a danger and can be dismissed from their mind. The important point I want to make about that is PTSD makes it very, very difficult for them to live in the moment. The third change in the brain is related to the self-sensing system. And this again is in the middle brain, and this is the part of the brain that is responsible for how we feel about ourselves. So for the person with PTSD, they often feel defensive, and with their self-sensing system blunted, it makes them very, very hard to connect with other people. The self-sensing system, when it is affected by PTSD, it also dampens the response of the survivor to feel pleasure, excitement, connection, and sensuality. And as a part of dealing with the pain of PTSD and some of these symptoms, they can often turn to self-medication or other vices for their very survival. So you can't talk about PTSD in relation to relationships without talking about what's called comorbid conditions of PTSD. And these are largely depressive and anxiety disorders, but they can also include substance abuse issues for many PTSD sufferers. I can only share from my personal experience with comorbidity related to PTSD that I have suffered depression and anxiety, both conditions that I still have to actively manage on a daily basis to the best of my ability. But I can understand myself not being an addictive personality, so therefore I wasn't threatened by substance abuse, but I could easily see, especially from my early grief, how easy it would be for people to want to use drugs and alcohol to numb this pain. And in fact, some research I came across actually cited a 30% statistic of individuals with PTSD that may never recover from their symptoms, dependent on how long they've suffered the trauma and how severe their symptoms are. So with respect to relationships, it's really important to understand that it's not only the symptoms of PTSD, such as insomnia, dissociation, fear, hypervigilance, avoidance, that the sufferer has to live with, but it's also these comorbid conditions, such as depression and anxiety, that everyone is subject to while they're trying to manage relationships. PTSD affects all of the sufferer's relationships, and most especially their intimate relationships with partners and family. And by intimate, I don't just mean the physical intimacy between partners, but I mean the level of trust and the ability to connect with family members that doesn't feel dismissive or hurtful to them. And all of the dysfunction arises with these damaged relationships, all because nobody has the ability to understand PTSD or the tools to manage their relationships. As they say, when one person has PTSD, everybody has PTSD. I'll post a separate video on PTSD and its symptoms and some self-soothing techniques to manage them. But for the purposes of this video related to relationships, there are 3 really important things to remember. The first is that PTSD changes the brain. It is an actual disorder with physical symptoms that need to be respected. 2, once you know that you have PTSD, it affects all of your relationships, and all of them have to be managed with the appropriate professional guidance and the right tools. It takes a lot of energy to work on relationships, and right now in my own personal life I have energy only to work on one, and that is of course with my spouse. And I really appreciate the fact that I've had someone in my life standing by me all these years when we really didn't understand PTSD, and we're now able to clarify the issues that we need to work with, or work on, I should say, that we've struggled with for years as a result totally of PTSD. A lot of couples split up after the death of a child, and so if you're in that situation and you're with a partner and you choose to go forward working through your trauma together, it can be done, but you do have to put, in my opinion, PTSD front and center of all the issues and struggles you want to tackle moving forward. It was a huge relief to both me and my spouse understanding this really critical part of grief. The third thing is once again, when you know you have PTSD, all of your relationships have to emotionally support you. That means that living with PTS requires emotionally supportive partners, no matter who it is. Science has now proven that in the treatment of PTSD, working with the right brain approach, which is the emotional center of the brain, is way more effective than traditional models that just come from an understanding of what PTSD is. Which means for personal relationships, it's critical that we have emotionally supportive partners in the various areas of our lives that we're seeking support, and that these people are able to understand PTSD and treat us with the compassion, sensitivity, tenderness, care, and love for us that will help us want to reconnect with them as our heart opens up. Understanding that in PTSD, one of the natural symptoms that we feel is isolation, and again, with that self-sensing filter making us feel very, very defensive, a lot of environments antagonize us, and therefore we shut people out. So that type of a relationship sounds really ideal to be in every type of partnership, whether it's siblings, children, husbands, wives, whatever, where they're fully supporting you like that. But when you're living with somebody that isn't naturally a right brain communicator, or that part of their brain hasn't been developed, there's going to be problems. Anyone from the viewpoint of the PTSD sufferer is going to become an enemy when they feel that they can't that they're not being understood, and that these problems that are monumental just aren't getting solved, when in a normal thinking brain there's no problem even that's existing. So you can see all the complications, and as a result of this dysfunction in communication, that really is a simple matter of someone being emotional, two people, the PTSD sufferer and the partner, whatever relationship it is, both being able to connect on just that emotional feeling level, we wouldn't have the amount of dysfunction there is and the number of breakups, which is really high. I don't really have the statistic. It's at least 50%, if not higher, probably more like 70 or 80% for couples who have lost a child. Ideally, we all want to feel like somebody cares for us. And in order to have that feeling, you have to be willing to be vulnerable with each other. And vulnerability comes from a place of being emotional, dealing with all the emotions, the good, the bad, the happy, the sad. And in grief, of course, there's going to be probably more bad and sad than happy, but trusting each other to go through these really, really difficult emotions can go a really, really long way to keeping couples and families together after traumatic loss. With the greatest respect to the medical professionals out there that really do want to help us, and they really do want to understand, what are we feeling in grief? What's happening to our families? What's happening to our relationships? They don't really relate to it if they haven't gone through it, especially loss of a child. So it's our responsibility as grievers to educate the people around us, our closest relationships, to the medical professionals out there who are trying to help us, what we're going through and what we need. As such, I've taken a great interest for years in my own mental health, my physical health, trying to understand grief, trying to understand suicide, and then inform those around me what it is I think I need or know I need at specific periods of time throughout my grief. So I turn to the medical professionals and rely on them to give me tools or an alternate point of view that maybe I can think about that I couldn't on my own, to continue to guide me to optimal healing. Some people may choose to go through this struggle on their own, having PTSD, living with trauma. And that's okay. People have to do what they need to do for themselves. But for me, I'm really, really grateful that I haven't had to go through it alone, and I would much prefer to go through the struggles with a partner whom I feel is supportive, caring about me, and loving towards me. In my own personal situation, again, once my husband and I understood that PTSD was the culprit for, I'm going to say, almost all of our problems, it has been very, very freeing and a great relief to understand that and know now where we have to put the focus, which is on PTSD, in order to move forward as a much stronger couple and create a much better healing environment for us all around. If you don't know whether you have PTSD or have even suffered trauma, I'm going to put a link to a checklist below this video, and you can complete it. And if you have concerns, I would strongly urge you to see your medical doctor, who can then refer you to the proper support. In the meantime, feel free to leave your comments, questions. I'll be coming back to this topic probably in the Trauma and Grief series again, because it's very, very complicated. And there's lots to learn and lots of tools to work with that can help us. Whether or not we ever fully recover isn't the point. There are ways that we can actually manage our lives to live very, very fulfilled ones, even living with something like PTSD. Stay tuned for more videos in this series. Thanks for watching.